Right, thank you so much for joining. Said good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're joining us from, to discuss Russia sanctions and how they affect your business. My name, a few introductions before we get going, but my name is Andrew Hood. I am a partner at Fieldfisher. Fieldfisher is a European law firm. We've got 25 offices across 11 different jurisdictions, and I head up the international trade team in London. And I am delighted to be joining today on this webinar with Venable and Ashley Craig, who's on screen. Ashley, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Andy. And again, to echo my colleagues' greetings, welcome wherever you may be. I'll keep this brief so we can get into substance, but I'm Ashley Craig. I co-chair our firm's International Trade and Logistics Group. And Venable, by way of a quick background, is a US-based firm with over 800 members, associates, colleagues across many different sectors. This topic is clearly not only timely, but of great interest. Andy and I have had the good fortune of collaborating since the early days of the conflict on behalf of clients on both sides of the Atlantic, as well as elsewhere. And we look forward to continuing that conversation here on this platform today. So welcome all, and Andy, back to you.
Thanks very much, Ashley. And just by way of brief admin, before we get going, Ashley and I will turn our cameras off, so it'll be slightly headless beings talking to you for the next 25 or 30 minutes, but there'll be plenty of time at the end, I think, for Q&A. So there's the usual Q&A box on the Zoom platform. Do feel free to put your answers in, or we put your questions in rather, and we'll try to pick up those answers either as we go through the presentation, or we'll turn to the Q&A at the end. I can say if for questions we can't get to, then we will record those and keep them, and then get back to you directly with any answers as soon as we can. So with that said, I'll stop my video and Ashley will stop his so that we can get going with the detail of the presentation. You can see it in all its glory. As Ashley was saying, it is a timely webinar, I hope, because sanctions do continue to develop pace both in the US, the UK, and in the EU, as well as across the world. Very difficult circumstances, of course, that bring us here on today, but which we shouldn't forget. But it's also about helping businesses navigate what that means for them and how they can best adjust their practices and cope with the ever-changing scene. In the next 25-30 minutes, we want to cover 4 or 5 different areas, a little bit of the outline about the scope of sanctions, what they are, how they apply, but also then touching on some practical things you can think about doing in terms of action you might take, and a brief checklist, which we hope is helpful. So that's the outline of what we hope to cover the next 25-30 minutes. What are sanctions? How do they apply? Well, we'll cover today a particular focus on US, UK, or EU sanctions. Of course, there's a UN dimension to sanctions, which people are often familiar with, but of course, in reality, given the Russian sanctions, given the veto of Russia in the UN, there are no UN sanctions that apply in this context. We look traditionally, therefore, at what the sort of different national or regional regimes are. As I say, we'll focus on US, UK, and EU sanctions, but of course there are many others, whether Australia, Japan, South Korea, Switzerland, and so forth. And we'll look at briefly at what sanctions are. Again, we'll go into more detail, but essentially looking at sort of the asset freeze, these denied or designated parties, substantive measures around trade restrictions and financial services restrictions, and then those that are regional specific, of course, in particular, the Donbass region, but of course also picking up on the Crimea region sanctions that also apply. So that's very broadly the scope of the sanctions that we'll be looking at in the course of today. I think the first key question that Ashley and I wanted to cover was really, when do they apply? Because clearly where you're doing business, how you're doing business has an impact. And just to pick up first with the EU sanctions, and hopefully the rationale for this will become clear, but essentially EU sanctions apply if you're an EU citizen and undertaking the activity that are prohibited by sanctions. That applies wherever you are in the world as an EU citizen. So if you're in the middle of Chile, undertaking actions that are prohibited by EU sanctions, you will be caught by those sanctions in terms of jurisdiction. Or they apply to EU incorporated entities or any business, of course, conducted in the EU. The UK is very similar. Again, applies to all UK citizens, wherever they are in the world, all UK incorporated entities and business in the UK. What we've seen in the UK, however, since the UK left the EU through Brexit a year or two ago, is a slightly broader approach to sanctions and nexus, i.e. when jurisdiction will apply. And that includes this other sufficient nexus bullet at the bottom. And it's, in all honesty, not entirely clear exactly what that means or how broad it goes, because we are in early days of the UK's post-Brexit world. But essentially, the guidance talks about transactions that with clearing services in the UK, or financial or insurance products that are bought in the UK, even if they're held or used overseas. So we are starting to see a slightly broader approach to sanctions. And then the US, which Ashley can talk to much more effectively. But the reason it's a bigger blob is frankly not because just of my poor PowerPoint presentation skills, but also because it's just a much bigger nexus. Sorry, Ashley.
Thank you, Andy. And as you can see here, the U.S. approach with regards to the Russian sanctions mimics longstanding U.S. approach to how we define a nexus, jurisdictional reach to U.S. persons, which include, of course, U.S. national citizens, permanent residents, importantly, wherever they may be located. I would also note that what we're finding with regards to Russia, as I've mentioned already, is not new here. U.S. persons, no matter where they may be located, must keep in mind that the restrictions attach. I can't tell you how many times over the course of the years in terms of practice, we've had this conversation about, well, I'm not within the United States physically, even though I hold a U.S. passport. Therefore, I'm outside of the reach of the U.S. authorities. That's just not the case. Conversely, if you're a non-U.S. national, but you happen to find yourself physically located in the United States, you are subject to the U.S. restrictions while you are on U.S. soil. This applies to U.S. incorporated entities and foreign branches to some degree. With regards to Russia sanctions in particular, we have U.S. persons and covered affiliates, which are prohibited from dealing directly or indirectly with designated entities. We're going to dig on that a little bit later, or engaging in otherwise prohibited transactions. There's also a facilitation component there that we're going to talk about, both from the EU, UK, and the US perspectives. And then lastly, this is a very important point here, nexus can be established through the, if you will, intangibles. So US-based servers that are picking up data, content, substance that would otherwise be non-US, foreign to foreign transactions, would then subject that transaction to US reach. And that has happened on more than a few occasions in the context of US sanctions, US export controls, and other related restrictions. Once again, we'll talk about that as well. So, Andy, back to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the big lesson I would take away is the US sanctions are much broader, or potentially in terms of the impact and scope they can have. But then turning to the substance of what we've got, looking at the asset freeze issue, the first of the three substantive points we highlighted earlier. Before sort of going into the detail, it's just worth flagging that we are today covering US, EU, and UK sanctions. We've tried to pull some of those core threads together. They're often based on a similar framework, albeit the nuance and the detail is quite different, and the enforcement, frankly, is also quite different, at least at the moment. But to try and provide a sort of a framework by which people can sort of work through some of these issues, hopefully we've tried to pull some common themes together. So the first of these, of course, is the asset freeze. It's often one of the big focuses of attention for all businesses. And the scope is frankly pretty broad. It requires a freezing of funds and economic resources of a sanctioned entity. And in the UK and EU, at least, economic resources includes the provision of services. It's also this prohibition on making funds or economic resources available directly or indirectly. And that, I think, together with the no circumvention rule, means essentially it is very difficult to simply say, well, I was dealing with a sanctioned entity with an assets freeze, but I'll go via a third party in order to provide a benefit to the sanctioned entity, more likely than not, you are invariably caught by the prohibition on providing resources or assets directly or indirectly, or of trying to circumvent those sanctions. So I think the key things we take away, and then Ashley could talk about the scope from the US side perhaps, but is this broad definition. There are exceptions and or licenses or grandfathering. So it's important to look at, are there particular exceptions that might apply? And we'll look at this later on, but perhaps there are humanitarian reasons or the provision of basic funds for basic goods and basic living essentials. But otherwise, it's normally about licenses or winding down a particular transaction or contract that might allow some wriggle room, but often not a huge amount. And then the other thing to pick up here is knowledge. And there's a real difference between the EU regime, which requires you as a business, in order to be found guilty of any breach of sanctions, to have known, or to ought to have known, where you ought to have known that you are breaching sanctions. The UK applies a similar test at the moment, but that changes on the 22nd of June when a strict liability offence comes into effect, whereby essentially, if you have breached sanctions, whether you knew it or not, but you're found to have breached sanctions, then you will be guilty of an offence. And the US similar has a strict approach. I mean, Ashley, I don't know if it's worthwhile just unpacking the US position a little on that too.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. I would note what we're finding here, which is quite unique, is that the US and in particular, UK approach are not lock, stock identical, but they are much more closely aligned than what we have traditionally seen vis-a-vis sanctions regime. The US historically has taken a more aggressive stance. So think Cuba, for example, as opposed to our partners around the world. But for obvious reasons, need not get into at the moment, what has happened with regards to the invasion of Ukraine has galvanized the international community. We see in the way that various sanctions programs have been stood up, that type of unity. So most of what you've just heard from my colleague from the US perspective is spot on as well. Having said that, keep in mind that the overarching objective of the sanctions is to inflict as much economic harm, political instability, as well as a creation of an overall unstable environment within the Russian Federation. We need not talk about whether that is advancing, but when you scratch your head and ask, why is this particular sanctions program in place, keep in mind a whole litany of foreign policy, national security, and other related concerns that are being put forward by, you can pick your country. In this case, we're talking about the US approach here. Interesting enough, the question of knowledge, as Andy alluded to, from a US angle, historically has never been one that you need to establish from a US government enforcement perspective. If you are subject to US jurisdiction in this case, then it is your responsibility to ensure that your transactions, your dealings are not in violation of the applicable sanctions program. Here, of course, we're talking about the Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus related concerns. So the government never has to establish that. It is presumed that you, as an individual, an entity, subject to the US jurisdictional reach of, in this case, the Treasury Department, which is the prime enforcer of the US sanctions regime, you are the one that has to be aware of and in compliance with. We'll talk a little bit later about certain mitigating factors if you end up crosswise with compliance from a sanctions angle, and what those variables may actually be that could assist in helping to bring down your exposure, but you're never going to get to zero for the most part. Andy, I think I've covered most of it, so I can flip it back to you.
Thanks. And your point about the purpose and the impact of these sanctions, or the intended impact, I think goes to the other issue about not only the scope of them, but who the addressees are. And I think we're pretty clear now that if you're in a business relationship with Vladimir Putin, you probably ought to think about what you're doing. But actually, looking at the scope of the addressees on a much more practical basis, you can start to see how business becomes really difficult. Not only the big high-level names, and there's 1,000 plus, but I think we are in the thousands now. But also looking at the prohibition on providing assets, including any monies for whatever reason, to certain banks, including the Central Bank of Russia. And so to pick an example of how that works in practice, we've had clients, for example, who have IP protections in place in Russia, and the licenses are required to be paid through the Central Bank of Russia, or specifically a subsidiary of it. But that is, under the UK and EU sanctions at least, is no longer possible. So you start to get real practical world difficulties in terms of how you're protecting your interests, as well as sort of ongoing commercial relationships. And then the thing I think to pick out in particular is the bottom bullet, which is around the impact of the assets freeze on non-listed entities, ones that aren't blatantly obvious on the listings, either at the UK, US, or EU level. And that's where they are owned or controlled in the UK and EU, or owned in the US context. What does that mean? It means, in the context of the UK and EU, if a listed entity has more than 50% ownership of another company that's not listed, actually that should be treated as listed, and therefore assets are frozen, and therefore your ability to transact, to provide services to, or work with that company will also be affected. And so it's a real question about how you practically go through and identify where these asset freezes apply, and what impact it may have on terms of the business you can do. Ashley can talk a bit about the US specifics, but under the UK and EU, it's more than 50% control, 50% or more control ownership. But it also has this strange or specific to the UK and EU regime definition of controlled, which means if a listed entity or an individual controls a particular entity, which means it has the right to appoint the board of directors, for example, or a majority of the board of directors, or has particular voting rights that give it essentially the ability to control the direction of an organization, then that organization, even if it's not listed, is to be treated as listed, and therefore its assets frozen under UK and EU sanctions. Actually, I know the US is slightly different.
To some degree, you're correct, Andy. So let's keep in mind that from the US perspective, with regards to the most recent actions taken against Russia, setting aside the fact that for the past 8+ years, we've had restrictions as a result of the Russian invasion and annexation of the Crimea Peninsula, but the president implemented the first executive order, 14024, back in April, following the invasion itself. That actually built on actions taken right after military operations were initiated by the Russians. But this laid the very foundation, attaching to those subject to US jurisdiction. It's a region country-based approach as opposed to a complete embargo. Again, think Cuba. So we have Crimea, we have Donetsk, we have Luhansk, the regions, the breakaway regions. And unfortunately, given the Russian military operations and advances in the east and the Donbass region in the last couple of weeks in particular, where they are gaining additional land, there will be additional restrictions placed on those occupied territories. In addition to that, we do have the designation of entities, individuals, oligarchs, politicians, financial institutions, which Andy was referencing a moment ago, as well as military and defense firms and operations. In the US parlance, this is referred to as the specially designated nationals list, or the SDN. I'm sure you're all well aware of that. More recently, another executive order was issued by the president, 14071, which targets new investment services as well in Russia. That's an expansion of the US approach. So we're fast approaching almost a near complete embargo from the US perspective. But to touch on the ownership issue, there is a control bit that the US will look at as well, but it's a 50% ownership rule. Those SDNs that I just referenced are very important because it is a question of ownership structure based on an SDN that's involved. Once you hit that SDN, you have to look downward. This is not new. This 50% ownership rule has existed in US sanctions for quite some time, going back to, for example, in the context of Russia, the response to the annexation of Crimea. We saw the sectorial sanctions that the US imposed and this 50% rule. That had a lot of US companies scratching their head, wondering, how deep do I dive? How do I do that? Obviously, our friends in Russia can be quite creative when it comes to shielding, hiding, and that's obviously not gone away. So we'll talk, I think, in a little bit about using third parties, obviously reaching out to counsel to conduct those type of reviews. But from the US perspective, once again, if you are subject to, you have to undertake due diligence, corporate governance structures, implement protocols. That is what is anticipated from the US authorities. And if you ever have to stand and deliver, they're going to want to see what you did by way of looking at ownership. So it can be frustrating and complex, but it is a reality of the US sanctions approach. Andy, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. I would say it is, as you say, it's nothing new, and it's nothing new in the UK and EU systems either, but it is, as you said, frustrating and complex. And unusually, I think, for the UK and EU systems, with all due respect to the US system, I think it's even more complex on this occasion for the UK and EU because of this notion of control. So even if a designated national or party does not have 50% or more ownership of a particular subsidiary, if they are deemed to control it because of the voting rights or systems that are in place, that can also mean that the non-listed entity becomes subject to sanctions. So it is really about doing some of that diving and due diligence, and I think having good systems and good compliance regimes in place. So we've laboured the point because often the sanction assets freezes and the sanctions really are the crux of the difficulties that most face. Then moving on to other restrictions, so more broadly the trade restrictions, and Ashley touched on these a little earlier, but to do a bit of a deeper dive, we've set out in very broad terms the types of restrictions we're starting to see, which applies to all of Russia at the moment. The dual use items and related services. So in the case of a dual use item, they can be the most innocuous of articles, but in reality, if they could be used for military purposes, then they might require, or they will require, an export license from the UK, EU, or US. If you've got dual use items, I trust you probably are aware of that fact. And so without diving into too much detail of what they are, good to know that your ability to export to Russia or to Russia via any other third country is going to be heavily restricted, if not prevented now. Similarly, sector specific, we've seen there are lots that could be there, but we flagged some of the main ones in terms of defense and security, aviation, oil refining, and related associated services, at least in the case of the UK and the EU, where if you're providing any technical or brokering services in relation to those particular products or sectors, then you might find yourself also subject to the trade restrictions, i.e. you can't provide those services going forwards. And similarly, a ban on certain goods, luxury goods, machinery, chemicals, plastics. The list is frankly growing, and it continues to grow. There is, I think in the case of the EU, some 40 odd chapters, i.e. 40 different types of goods, almost half the type of goods in the customs code that might be restricted in terms of exports. So really worthwhile just checking what you're producing, what you're sending, what you're exporting, and how. And then, as I say, some limited public humanitarian and public health exceptions to some of those in the case of the UK and the EU at least. And then import restrictions, again, getting a lot more traction in media at the moment. Clearly, certain precious metals, iron, steel products. In the case of the US, seafood and fish and alcohol products. And then also oil and oil-related products. For those that use Russia to transit oil across Russia, but where it doesn't originate from or isn't owned by Russian nationals, then it may well be that you are not prohibited, but there can be real practical difficulties of proving some of that origin of the goods. I know that US and and the EU have been looking at or dealing with some of those technical issues on how this works in reality. Actually, do you want to touch on a US specific dimension there, or do you think that covers the ground?
Yeah, I would just note once again, Andy, as I referenced at the beginning, perhaps one of the positives of the situation is that we do see harmony from a US, EU, UK perspective. So I know in the past we have clients that have struggled to some degree about how do I prioritize compliance with US, EU, UK. The most conservative way has historically been to look at the US, which has typically been a bit more aggressive, a bit broader in application. And if you're in compliance there, then by default, it's going to trickle down and you're going to be okay from a EU or UK perspective. In the context of the Russian sanctions, we do see this, again, united front approach. So although there are some nuances here and there, everything that you've just heard from my colleague is essentially good from a US perspective. I would note that in the context of what you can still do, by default, as you heard from Andy, humanitarian relief, those type of transactions are still flowing for obvious reasons. But we are seeing greater scrutiny from a US enforcement perspective. Keep in mind that there are multiple agencies involved. I referenced the Treasury Department, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, which is the prime enforcer of the economic and trade sanctions. But we also have parallel corresponding US export controls. So dual use, for example, here is going to be enforced for the most part by our friends at the Commerce Department. And most recently, there have been comments coming out of high-ranking Commerce Department officials about the need to ratchet up enforcement, scrutiny of transactions. At the beginning of the military confrontation and the imposition of restrictions, there were a great deal of questions. There are still questions, otherwise we wouldn't be spending this hour with you here today. But having said that, there were transactions that were still in motion. Here we are now, unfortunately, 100 plus days since the invasion started, and the situation is only getting more concerning, at least in the eastern part of the Ukraine. And as a result, these restrictions are in place. We have seen some stability from awareness. I think that the US government has done a good job of trying to get the word out through a series of engagement with trade associations, with individual entities that are involved in the region, as well as the issuance of a series of FAQs coming from multiple different agencies involved with enforcement. That's actually, frankly, a bit unprecedented in the sense that we've seen it come out so quickly. This is a completely atypical way to approach drafting and implementing sanctions. And I will defer to Andy because he, in a former life, did just that from a government perspective. It's been breakneck speed, and not only from the US side, but from the EU and the UK as well. So, Andy, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley, for outing me. I was in my former life a UK foreign office lawyer, and I spent some time in Brussels negotiating EU sanctions as well. So I got a bit of familiarity with how this works. And you're right, certainly from the UK and EU perspective, I don't think we've ever seen sanctions prepared at this level, or frankly with this ferocity. And breadth and scope of sanctions. And actually, you touched earlier on the big overlap between the US and EU and UK. And I think traditionally the US has always been both broader and more strictly enforced. I think we are starting to see still a big Venn diagram where both overlap a lot and there's a lot of coordination. But actually, even the EU going further than the UK going further than it's usually done, and somewhat off kilter sometimes with the US. So it's always, I think, important to check for all jurisdictions. I do think if you cover most of those jurisdictions, you end up also picking up the sanctions that are picked up and addressed by others in, say, Australia or New Zealand or Japan, or wherever it may be. But they are certainly getting broader and more ferocious. And also to pick up your point on enforcement, in the UK, the financial sanctions is done by OFSI. These trade restrictions done by Department of International Trade, again across different EU member states, although the law is derived at EU level for the most part for sanctions. Actually, the enforcement is done at the national level by different authorities across the different EU member states. So sometimes quite a complex web to try and understand and to try and navigate as you're looking at the different restrictions that have been put in place. And that takes us on to the last set of, trade restrictions that are there, particularly around services, financial services being a real focus for many. I think partly because of the nature of how integral it is to many projects and investment projects and undertaking, but also just some of the practical reality, looking at the banks, the sort of second bullet down on the left, for example, the use of banks and the access to SWIFT, simply being able to transfer money for perfectly legitimate trade that's going on in Russia can be increasingly difficult because of banks' access or lack of access to SWIFT. And frankly, from experience of just nervousness of banks doing any business in Russia, however proper it may be. I think, for example, of a Danish bank not wanting to transfer various funds to a branch of an Italian bank because the branch was based in Moscow, albeit that it was perfectly proper and legal reasons. But there was just that sort of real practical nervousness and about how to proceed. And similarly, deposit cap in EU accounts, and UK has announced a similar cap, i.e. it's about £50,000 cap and €100,000, I think, in the EU. What Russian nationals or those based in Russia, Russian nationals based outside of the EU without any EU member residency or nationality are subject to particular caps. I pick up on that example because actually it really goes to Ashley's point, which was how fast and far these are moving. The UK in particular is guilty, I think, of announcing many things, but then taking some weeks, and in this case of the EU, the cap on deposits, taking some months to enforce it. So there's often a confusion between what the UK government has said and then what it's actually enacted to do. So it's always worthwhile keeping a close eye on that. And there are lots of other services, accountancy, consultancy, insurance or reinsurance in some cases, and the US have a particular focus around some, and the EU has a limitation on trust services, as does the US, and the US focus on corporate formation and services. Similarly, energy-related services, particularly supporting those in the oil infrastructure. At the moment, legal services are not prohibited. Ashley can talk a bit more the nuance there. And then finally, just the very broad regional trade restrictions, which again, I won't repeat because Ashley, I think, touched on that earlier. I essentially, although if it becomes critical to a business, one can always look at the sort of the real detail, but essentially any trade to all intents and purposes with Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk, and as Ashley said, potentially other areas that are occupied by Russia in the long term may be subject to similar trade restrictions, whereby doing any business with those in those regions is particularly difficult. Again, not that one will be doing much trade at the moment, but just thinking about distribution agreements that are in place with any Ukrainian providers or suppliers, all worth thinking about in terms of practically organizing a business going forward. Actually, do you want to sort of add in particular? I've sort of taken the US position very broadly, but if you want to dive in on specifics.
No, thank you, Andy. Let me first pause. I'm mindful of our time, and I believe we're right around that mark where those of you that are attending for CLE credits, please note it is business 2022. Again, the CLE word is business 2022. Yes, so Andy, you did a great job, I think, of touching on the U.S. perspective here too. It's important to go back and recall that when the first set of U.S. restrictions were imposed, there was a great debate that was being held, which was how much damage do we inflict on the Russian situation? And by that, I mean in a very broad sense, not only the economic, political, military, but by extension, essentially the entire Russian state. And as a result, there was an attempt to try to strike a balance. In response to the Russian aggression and the fact that it was not stopping, it was expanding, and frankly continues to, you saw from a US perspective, and then an EU and a UK, an expansion of the restrictions in the financial services sector. We don't need to waste or eat up time in terms of those banks that have been designated. I think that it's been well established, and there are few and far in between that are still out there that are not it from a US perspective. But more recently, again, EO 14071 established the prohibitions on new investment in services in the Federation. And Andy did touch upon, and very similarly from a US and the UK perspective, it includes accounting, trust, corporate formation, management consulting services. And as well as you heard from my colleague, legal services are not hit with a caveat in the sense that it's not unique to the Russian sanctions. This is a longstanding approach from a US perspective. But if one is designated and, for example, believes that he or she should not be, there is a process by which you can request delisting. And it is an administrative / legal perspective that you need to embrace. US counsel is often approached. US counsel cannot engage until our friends at the Treasury Department have said that you can. That applies here today as well. What we know, anecdotally speaking, is that any request is slow moving before the Treasury at the moment for a variety of reasons. But if in fact someone is seeking such advice, such counsel, the first process, of course, is to ensure that counsel is authorized to engage. And that is likely going to take quite some time before you get to a resolution. And I would say that in this environment, although there's not a policy / presumption of denial, it may very well be by default. That's where we are in trying to get that type of authorization to act. So again, the US and the EU / UK, I guess I shouldn't say / any longer, Andy, my apologies.
Not.
Are pretty much aligned when it comes to this. And again, the overarching reason is to inflict that type of damage on the economic structure. Andy and I have both seen this kind of spread out into the secondary market. Whole litany of questions that kind of bubble up there. Within the last week, our friends at OFAC have released a new FAQ that touch on the secondary market as well. So for those of you that are interested, curious, that's something that we could talk about offline as we move forward here. But Andy, I'll flip it back to you.
Thanks, Ashley. So that, I mean, broadly covers the sense of what the substance of these sanctions are. We just wanted to turn, as we promised at the beginning, to a bit of action, a bit of sort of practical advice or insights that we've seen that worked well. And if it may, at risk of stating the blindingly obvious, the first thing to do, of course, is assess the impact of sanctions and whether they apply. And hopefully today is a step in that right direction for that. In terms of sort of practical options and things to think through, consider, for example, are any of your employees or directors or shareholders of a nationality that might be affected by sanctions? Are they UK, EU, US nationals or green card holders? And pick up a question actually that's come in the course of the presentation, and say do use the Q&A function to ask any questions you've got, and we'll do our best to answer as we go along or to pick them up at the end. But one of the questions that's put says, so an EU passport holder in the UK and working for a UK firm is caught by EU restrictions, even if their firm has no EU connections? Answer, very simply, yes. EU passport holder, an EU national, even if they're in the UK, working for a UK firm, and let's assume that transactions have no other EU connections at all, would still be caught by EU sanctions. That said, and we'll pick this up again in the course of the next few minutes, there are ways to think about how that is managed, how you are framing your business, how you think about the transactions. Do you have recusal policies in place which can help demonstrate that the individual in question was not involved in a particular transaction should the authorities come knocking. So, but in order to know what you're doing and how to, manage that, really, again, apologies for the blindingly obvious point, but do assess the impact of those sanctions. Who are your employees? What are their nationalities? Who are your business partners? Have you done screening? How much screening should you do? How far down that track should you go? This is Ashley's point about, how deep do you dive? And what can you show the authorities you've done? And that may depend on the nature of the business you have, about the risk profile you or your shareholders or board may have, but all things to think through. Think about what red flags are out there, or the information you do or don't have, and think about all parties to the transaction, of course, and how you're paying them, so on and so forth. But just doing that sort of assessment of what sanctions are out there and how they might apply, and then, again, at the risk of stating the blindingly obvious, stop anything that's prohibited. I say that, again, just picking up the points that we were talking about earlier. In the UK, the new strict liability offence comes into force on the 22nd of June. You've got a very stringent approach adopted in the US. The EU requires you to have known, or ought to have known, but again, recognising the breadth of Russian sanctions and the nature of your business, which you'll be expected to understand, I would not imagine the authorities have a particularly lenient point of view as to whether you ought to have known about the potential impact of sanctions. Penalties being the obvious one, one obvious driver. They are criminal penalties for breach of sanctions. In the US, they are particularly severe. In the UK, they are growing, and in the EU, they're going to grow further as well, I'm sure. And then there's, of course, the very real point, which is around commercial reputational damage. Excuse me. The UK Treasury has taken on new powers to report any companies with a reasonable belief that where they have a reasonable belief they've breached sanctions. So something of a name and shame approach, recognizing that it might be hard to prosecute or successfully prosecute. There is this more sort of lenient approach to more lenient for the Treasury's point of view, but of course, severe reputational damage shown if you are seen to have breached sanctions. And of course, as you come down to any future M&A or selling business or any due diligence that's undertaken, looking at your sanctions policies and records is going to be hugely important. Similarly, just picking up on some of the other practical things to do. What can you do once you've done that assessment and that overview? Think about reviewing any contractual rights or obligations. Again, many on the call may have done that already, given where we are in the process. But in the UK and EU context, at least, if you've got any force majeure clauses, i.e. something that says as an act of nature or an act of God outside of our control, we won't be responsible for fulfilling our particular contract. Traditionally, in these jurisdictions at least, sanctions have been a much more part of the context of regulatory changes, which are traditionally seen as foreseeable in any contract. So you need to look at what your contract clauses say. Think about a particular sanctions clause that you might want to put in. Think about any workarounds that might be out there. How do you conduct transactions? What do your supply chains look like? How can you manage that in a framework that still respects the need not to sort of directly or indirectly provide benefit to sanctioned parties or individuals? And then I think, just to pause, and again, Ashley has talked about this already and may want to say a little more, but these compliance arrangements and having them in place, I think, is going to be hugely important. From a UK perspective, we've got a similar provision of strict liability under our anti-money laundering offences, where if you have a compliance policy in place, it's actually a defence to doing what you could reasonably have done. That's not the case for sanctions, but I do think that if any authorities, at least in the UK and certainly in the EU, see compliance policies in place, see you've done training, see you've got proper systems arranged, whether your employees and directors are engaged in the process and understand the process, all of that, I think, helps to, A, of course, reduce the risk of this happening at all, but B, shows the authorities that you have been, diligent, thorough, as thorough as you could be, corporate players in this space. So I wouldn't say it eliminates, but it may help reduce the risk and reduce the penalties that might follow. That said, I'm conscious that the US has a particularly stringent approach to enforcement. So always better to try and avoid that entirely rather than simply minimize the pain once it arrives. Do you think, Ashley?
Absolutely, Andy. And I would also just, in the interest of time, say that everything you've heard from my colleague would apply from a U.S. compliance perspective. Once again, we see alignment, which is a little bit of a unique situation vis-a-vis prior sanctions engagements. I would note, though, that from a U.S. perspective, enforcement, although we are still in the, if you will, early phases of the implementation of this sanctions regime, is coming. We've heard bits and pieces of enforcement already from a U.S. export control perspective, U.S. Customs stepping in, the Commerce Department making certain that there's greater awareness, stopping the physical transactions to Russia, to Belarus, to the occupied regions when there is a reason to do so. And in fact, the U.S. Commerce Assistant Secretary for Export Enforcement, Matt Axelrod, gave a speech about 2 weeks ago before a trade association where he made it very clear that under his watch, there will be increased enforcement, increased penalties, more transparency when it comes to the charging orders. All of this transcends Russia's sanctions, but it does envelop the Russian sanctions as well. The signal, in my opinion, is clear. The U.S. administration is going to enforce across a very wide front the sanctions, the export controls that they have inherited from previous administrations, as well as those that they're building on, in particular with regards to Russia. I'd also note that there is a facilitation concern from a U.S. angle, and those of you online that are U.S. persons, U.S. entities are probably aware of this. But this is a restriction on U.S. persons from engaging directly or indirectly in any sort of facilitation of a transaction, which would otherwise be directly prohibited, period, full stop. That applies even to a bunch of lawyers. That's why I referenced earlier that if you're going to be brought in to help an SDN go through a delisting process, need that prior authorization. Otherwise, you're in conflict. So keep in mind that the facilitation prohibition from a U.S. angle is something that the authorities do invoke. It is not an exception. It is frankly the norm. The watchword here is be practical. Everything you heard from Andy, I agree with completely in terms of establishing some sort of baseline from a compliance perspective. What we typically tell clients, because we are mindful, there's only so much you can do. I don't care if you're the largest of the large or you're a small operator. The world is flat and continues to be so, and we are interwoven with others, and notwithstanding the policies in the last couple of years, that really hasn't changed. So take a look at what you've done over the course of the last 5, 10 plus years in terms of corporate governance. Draw in, for example, how you might approach anti-bribery and anti-corruption, third-party vetting as you onboard a new vendor, a new overseas affiliate, someone acting on your behalf. Chances are you'll be able to pull from what you already have in place and apply it to the vetting and screening of transactions that might touch pretty close to what we're talking about here today from a, if you will, physical perspective, geographic footprint, as well as dealing with business partners that may be located, say, for example, in Central or Eastern Europe. Take a look at what you have in place. There's not the need to go out and rebuild, but this is the time to take a look and see if you may need to refresh a bit. So, Andy, back to you. I'm watching the clock here tick.
Yeah, no, I'm conscious of that. And headless people have been talking on to a slideshow for 50 minutes. But I think it's really your point about something that's practical and proportionate and flexible, I think is really sensible and something we do all the time with clients. I know you do it too, Ashley. It's important to have a policy in place and training and systems that are suitable for you as an organization and any record keeping, but it's also it's got to it's got to fit the bill, and you can't inhibit your business entirely, because you'll be complying, but you'll also be out of business. So it's always about finding something practical and sensible. And to that end, that's really why we've just at the very end put this sort of checklist, to things to think through, really picking up what we've talked through in the course of today. And I think to your point about enforcement, actually, in the UK, I think we are going to see a lot more enforcement. The UK government has announced, I think, almost a doubling of budget for the OFSI team, and I think that comes with a greater focus on, helping to operationalise the sanctions they put in place, because frankly, it is not as fast as it might be, being very frank, but also about greater enforcement and making sure that these sanctions bite and have an impact. So I think for all those reasons, it's good to have thought about this, to take some of those key steps in terms of assessing the risk, and then thinking about what you can practically do to minimize the risk and impact for the company and organization. So this hopefully is a useful checklist just at the end to pick up some of those points. And what I may do now is go back on video, just so that you can not entirely headless for the entire period. And actually, if you're able to join as well, one of the questions we've had in, which I think is a familiar one to you, as it is to me, which is a $64 million or perhaps $64 billion or $1 trillion question of how long do you think these sanctions will remain in place? I'll give you the crystal ball firstly, Ashley.
Let's start with an easy one. You're right. We are hearing that as well. And what we're telling folks is, unfortunately, the situation obviously has not stabilized. I mean, to some degree, it has in the Western parts, but Russia seems to be making slow but sustained progress in the Donbass region. They've essentially reconstituted and reprioritized their engagement and seem to be focused there. There's no indication that the conflict is going to reach a stalemate anytime soon. And keep in mind that this is a conflict that is already 8+ years old. So everything that we're talking about here today, which is only going to become a bit more complicated, we anticipate additional restrictions coming online from not only the US, but our friends in the UK, as well as on the continent. That means that you're going to have to build into your business processes compliance. Think when the Trump administration imposed the Section 301 tariffs, and there was a, if you will, a seismic shift to some degree, not to the extent that some people wanted, out of sourcing from China. Businesses had to put into plan new options. Same thing here. And I will say that it looks like the private sector has stepped up very quickly to not only comply, but to ensure that they were not inadvertently stepping on one another. So I think that's a long way, Andy, of saying it's going to be here for quite some time, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a sad and terrifying prospect in many respects, but I say I have to agree. There's nothing, I think, short of a major seismic shift in Moscow, seeing these things change, everything will ratchet up depending upon the outcome or impact of them. Best case scenario is they remain relatively steady, but I think we're going to see some ongoing shifts, certainly from the UK EU perspective. I've never seen sanctions move this quickly or this fast, or this breadth, really. We're not familiar with the entire regime approach that the US have adopted, so it's really very significant, and nothing's going to change in the near to medium term for sure.
On a related note, a question that's come in, and I'll direct it to you first, is we've just established it looks like it's here to stay. But what about a change on the domestic political front in the United Kingdom? We just obviously saw that the Prime Minister has weathered a no confidence vote, and from what I read, he's there. He's perhaps wounded. Not to put you on the spot, but what if there is a changing of the guard? Could that impact everything that we're talking about in one way or another here?
Well, actually, whatever you think of our Prime Minister, he's a survivor. So probably won't be going anywhere in the near future. On a very formal level, he's got another year without another no confidence vote. And politicians all have a very very thick skin, and he seems to be determined to carry on. Frankly, regardless of whether he is in power or not, I can't see this changing at all. It's been a political drum that both parties have beat. Both are keen, for quite understandable reasons, to look very tough on sanctions and on the deterrence factor they might bring for Russia, and that's not going to change, regardless of who the prime minister is, even under a Conservative government and even under a Labour government. So that's not going to change. But I think you've got midterms coming up.
We do. It's that time of a 4-year term, and all indications seem to be that the Democratic Party is going to lose seats. The question is to what extent. Obviously, we don't have a presidential election for another few years, although it feels like we're in the middle of it already. I would note that this is probably, as I mentioned to you the other day, the first single issue in I don't know how long that has brought Democrats and Republicans together across the aisle. Not completely, but the vast majority of members on both sides have come forth and support the president's approach. The criticism that has been levied a little bit has been move quicker, move stronger. Having said that, there have been 2 packages that have moved through the Congress, and the president has implemented those. So this is a very strong bipartisan issue, and it doesn't seem to indicate at the moment anyway that the American public seems to be losing interest. Having said that, again, we're already 100 plus days in, no sign of it moving to a stalemate, and more importantly, to a sign of peace negotiated, if you will. We'll see how long the interest remains. The sanctions may remain in place much longer than the interest of the American people. But for now, there is strong bipartisan support to keep the pressure on Russia. So I think that translates into watch out for enforcement. It's coming for those of you that are taking advantage of the situation or inadvertently stumble.
Yeah, I'm slightly conscious of time, but a couple of questions that have come in. One is really about the position in Russia, which I don't pretend to be qualified to advise on in terms of what the Russian legislation is. I'm sure, I don't know if Venable in the same position. We work with local Russian partners to provide legal advice so that clients have a sort of a unified position, but I don't pretend to be qualified in order to talk about Russian law in the course of a webinar, so apologies for that. But one very brief final question, which is around the humanitarian exemptions and whether a company active in the manufacturing of foodstuffs qualifies under this exemption per se, to which the answer is it's not entirely clear. Certainly from the UK, from the EU perspective, if there are sanctions in place, they then provide for certain exemptions in the case of what's then defined as humanitarian purposes, health emergencies, the prevention and mitigation of serious significant impact on human health or safety. So it's not well defined, but what I would recommend is that there are ways of engaging with governments or in order to provide certain reassurance to companies around whether what they're doing meets those exemptions, and or to get, this sounds rather self-serving, but to get advice which at least helps cover one's back in terms of having done one's best to identify what the humanitarian exemption might be. I can say from the EU and UK perspective, they differ slightly depending upon what the sanctions are and therefore what exemptions apply. And I think the context is everything. So per se, foodstuffs, I don't think that's the case, but it may be possible to identify. It's also a question about whether they're caught in the first place. So for a large part of a lot of goods aren't necessarily banned unless they are going to the Luhansk, Donetsk, Crimea region, or if they are particular luxury goods that are subject to export control restrictions in any event. So it's always worth looking at what the product is, whether it's permitted, and if it's restricted, then of course you look closer at whether the humanitarian exemption can apply.
Andy, I agree from a U.S. perspective, spot on as well. The one thing I would just note is keep in mind, you also need to look, and I think this is the same from your side too, Andy, at who that recipient is, who that consignee in the transaction may very well be. So you could find yourself moving medical goods that are cleared, but they're going into the hands of a military end user, direct or indirect, and then that becomes problematic. So again, the watchword here is vets and screen. And that also goes to those of you that are physically moving goods into the region, maybe even into the Federation. Look to your transportation provider, your logistics solutions provider, make certain that they're engaged. They too have obligations. They cannot simply just turn away from the deal and say, I don't have a vested interest, so therefore I am not going to step up. That's not how the US government perceives things. So you should also make certain that you're pushing your service providers and making certain they are aware of the situation too.
Yeah, that's probably a great point to end on, which is a lot of this, frankly, is around collaboration, of finding ways through and understanding sort of shared destinies, shared obligations, and hopefully to find a suitable way through that keeps businesses running, and in very difficult circumstances means that business can flow into Russia where it's proper and permissible, but also that people are adhering to the obligations of what Ashley's described already, which is an objective of governments on both sides of the Atlantic, and around the world, actually, to see some real change and some real change in Ukraine and in Russia's activities. So let's all hope that does happen. But until then, we will remain able and happy to advise and to help people chart their way through these tricky issues. So Ashley, thank you very much for
Thank you, Andy,
for co-partnering with me on this. It's been great.
Likewise, I really appreciate the opportunity, enjoyed it, and I hope our attendees found it to be insightful and practical. And we'll do it again. Unfortunately, something tells me that we will be doing it again. But I really appreciate it, and thanks to you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thanks all.